Well, it's about time I got around to this one. Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Eye of the Beholder, the first game I'm covering on the show based on Dungeons & Dragons, and perhaps one of the most pivotal 3D dungeon crawls ever to be produced, as it set numerous standards which other 3D dungeon crawls have mimicked since then. And not just in terms of DOS games, but even modern games such as Legend of Grimrock, which may look HD and modern, but features many of the same mechanics. Now, because of that, I'd actually been dreading playing this thing. See, I've never actually played a D&D based computer game before. I've played a couple D&D games on the NES, but they weren't exactly dungeon crawls in the usual sense, as one of them had strategy based combat, while the other was an abysmal platformer. And knowing what I already did about the Eye of the Beholder games, and having played other non-D&D games with the same mechanics, I was kinda expecting this one to utterly destroy me with excessive difficulty and frustrating situations. Instead, it turns out this game's actually incredibly well balanced, despite having to fit D&D mechanics into an action format, which is restricted to tunnels and formation-based movement. Now don't get me wrong, this game can and will decimate you if you give it half a chance, but oftentimes it's because you made a mistake, not because the game itself is being evil. I mean, yes, it will be evil, but I hear they make a first level spell for that. Granted, there are a few minor annoyances for sure, but let's just quickly get those out of the way so that I can focus on the rest of this thing. 1, if you accidentally click to swap a party member into another position, it cancels out being able to click on anything else until you do. 2, getting poisoned without a way to cure it is pretty much a reload if you want any chance of beating this thing. 3, the mouse cursor disappears sometimes during enemy attacks, which can make it tricky to buffer your own actions. And 4, there's only one save slot. This not only means you have to be careful not to save if bad things have happened, but it also means you can only have one run going at a time and thus can't easily experiment with different party setups. Eye of the Beholder was developed by Westwood Associates, which would later go on to become Westwood Studios, and was published through SSI Strategic Simulations Incorporated in 1991, and is best described as a one-player 3D dungeon crawl. It supports pretty much every 320x200 video mode common to DOS PCs, from 4-color CGA all the way up to 256-color MCGA, but only has support for a trio of basic audio devices. Yes, the box touts having Sound Blaster support, but like a lot of early 90s games, it doesn't actually have any digitized sound effects at all, and it's only saying this to avoid confusion, since Sound Blaster cards are fully compatible with ad-lib sound. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, but is available on the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com as a trilogy pack of all 3 Eye of the Beholder games for $10. Now, if you want a physical copy, this is thankfully one of the few DOS games which doesn't really have any drawbacks when you go hunting for one nowadays, as it's easy to find and relatively simple to discern the differences between the various platforms it's available on. The only trick, though, is that it is moderately priced, with most copies going for between $15 and $40 depending on condition, and this is partly because most copies are fully boxed due to the game having manual-based copy protection. Thus, regardless of anything, make sure you're getting the manual when you get a physical copy. There's also physical trilogy packs out there as well, which include all 3 games in the series, and while those are harder to find, they typically go for about the same price. Needless to say, you have plenty of options for getting this game physically, if you don't mind spending a bit. Also, one other thing I want to quickly point out, there's a game on Steam called Eye of the Beholder, yet it has absolutely nothing to do with this game, as it's meant to be a VR war-themed thought experiment in terms of whether or not you end up trusting people you don't know in those kinds of conditions. I mean, it's free if anyone wants to try it, but again, nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. Ooh boy, I am not well versed on the deep lore of the Dungeons & Dragons universe, but I'm gonna do my best to summarize the story because there is a ton of it, even though most of it is in the manual and not the game itself. As for the setting, the game takes place entirely in the city of Waterdeep, which started life over 1,000 years prior as nothing more than a simple stop for merchant ships trading up in the northern parts of the Faerun continent. Over time and across many conflicts, Waterdeep grew substantially, ultimately becoming the largest city in the area, with many thousands of inhabitants, ruled by a council of lords, only one of whom at any point in time is publicly known, with the rest being shrouded in secrecy. However, trouble is brewing. Reports of assassins roaming the streets and other forms of unrest have risen considerably, and all investigations are showing that there is a great evil afoot. But trying to figure out where the evil is emanating from has been futile. After many attempts to pinpoint the source of this evil, it's clear that it's not coming from outside the city, but from within. And with the surface ruled out, the only possible conclusion is that this evil must be coming from beneath the city, either in the sewers below or possibly deeper. To that end, the lords use their magic to summon a band of heroes to their aid, and thus your party shows up. Lord Pirgiren, whose name I'm having a heck of a time pronouncing, greets you all and first presents you with a letter disclosing the efforts the lords have made to try and figure out where this evil is and how the sewers beneath must be the source, followed immediately by a letter of marque, officializing your commission to defeat the evil detected under the city, making interference with your efforts illegal, and permitting your group full rights to any and all treasure you happen to find. While at first this doesn't seem like it'll amount to anything too outrageous, it becomes clear very quickly that this evil is watching and making plans, as only moments after your party enters the sewers beneath the city, the tunnel not only slams shut and locks behind you, but completely caves in as well, trapping your party within the sewers. With nowhere to go but forwards, it's now up to you and your party to either put an end to this evil or die trying. And yes, the first quarter of this game effectively amounts to 3 massive sewer levels. The irony is not lost on me. Now before you begin playing, you have to create a party of 4 adventurers. Now, as far as I'm aware, the game utilizes the AD&D 2nd edition rule set. So Thaco is still a thing, armor class is better the lower it is, and there's a bunch of restrictions in terms of which races can become what classes and such. But the character generator is done surprisingly well, and can handle pretty much every valid combination you throw at it. The races you can choose between are human, elf, dwarf, half-elf, gnome, and halfling, while the classes you can choose between are fighter, paladin, ranger, thief, mage, and cleric. Though certain races are indeed allowed to dual class or even triple class. There's also restrictions in terms of what kinds of characters can be in the party based on the alignments of the characters that you create. One thing I find very interesting though is that when you get to the point of rolling stats for a party member, there's a button labeled Modify. And clicking this button allows you to directly assign whatever numbers you want to each stat, within what would be considered a valid range for the race and character class you've selected. Now, the official reason why the game allows you to do this is so that you can bring your own D&D characters into this game world without having to spend forever rolling a similar character. Though unofficially, this is basically a means of difficulty control, since the more unnaturally high you assign everyone's stats, the easier the game will be. Or you could just use your favorite rolling method in real life and apply it here manually. Now, just like with the original Final Fantasy on the NES, some combinations of party members are going to be more problematic than others. Not that you couldn't win with them, it would just be a lot more challenging, as the campaign on offer here is definitely more geared towards combat. For instance, a party of all thieves is probably not going to get very far. Even a party of all clerics could do better thanks to their magic. I decided on a paladin, fighter, mage, and cleric for my playthrough, no multi-classing. And I also noticed after creating my party that all characters in this game start with 5,000 experience points. So generally speaking, your party members will start around experience level 3, not level 1, which definitely helps give you an edge at the start. Now, the game begins right where the intro sequence left off, with the sewer tunnel caved in and nowhere to go but deeper. Now, controlling the game can be done entirely with the mouse, and just for sake of experimentation, I decided to focus exclusively on mouse control, though the game can be controlled entirely with the keyboard too, though it's definitely more optimal to do both, such as using the keyboard to move around and the mouse to perform actions or manage your inventories. Generally speaking, you use the left mouse button to grab or drop things, and the right mouse button to interact and perform actions, which does take a little getting used to since almost everything responds differently to either button. Clicking on a character portrait allows you to see their inventory, along with a page flip tab in the bottom corner to switch to their stats screen. One thing I find kinda unusual is that even though the game is pretty good at tracking stats, it doesn't allow you to see your exact hit points at any moment after character creation, nor does it allow you to see the stats of the equipment you find, which is weird given that in any proper D&D session, it would be kinda hard to roll attacks and stuff if you didn't know the stats of your own equipment. Well, the manual helps with a few things, most notably spells, but details of the various equipment is absent from the manual, instead found in a separate code book, which does indeed come with the GOG release of the game, but with a physical copy, you'd have had to buy it separately. Right-clicking on a party member's equipped hands allows that party member to act with those items. For swords and axes and such, the character will just swing them. For daggers, the character will throw them. For bows, the character will either fire an arrow in their other hand or one from their quiver. Or for spellbooks or holy symbols, it'll open up the spellcasting menu where memorized spells can be cast from. You can also click on a party member's name, and this will allow you to swap their position in the party to another slot. Now, taking advantage of moving party members around is surprisingly important, as it allows you to keep hurt party members alive if they take a few too many hits in combat, seeing as how the two people at the top represent the front row of the party, and the only two party members who can strike at melee range with enemies in front. As such, they're also the only two vulnerable to melee attacks, unless you're being attacked from the side or from the back. The members in the back row, however, can still use ranged physical and magical attacks if they have them, or attack on their appropriate sides if necessary. Now, because the action moves at its own pace, there is some strategy when it comes to positioning, and there can even be strategy in dodging out of the way before an enemy strikes. For instance, when you start fighting Kuotoas on the 3rd floor of the sewers, they have a ranged lightning attack. Now, if you see this coming ahead of time, you can potentially sidestep out of the way and have it pass by you. Though you do have to react fast, as everything is following a sort of action queue system, meaning only one action can be performed at a time, and if multiple actions try to occur together, they'll happen in the order they were executed in. This means if an enemy is attacking you with a melee attack, even if you see it ahead of time and click to step out of the way, their attack is already queued and must complete before your now queued movement command will be executed. Suffice to say, it takes a bit to get used to the combat, but it's thankfully extremely well balanced. As you start the game fighting kobolds and giant leeches, a couple of the weakest enemies in the world of D&D, and while the next floor down introduces skeletons and zombies, if you have a cleric in your party, these undead foes will instantly be turned when they confront you, giving you a chance to strike them down more easily until the turning wears off, or you back them into a spot that they can't escape from. Well, this kind of leads into one thing I find incredibly forgiving about the game, especially when compared to other 3D dungeon crawls which followed this one trying to mimic its style. As far as I could tell, enemies were not capable of randomly spawning. Now don't get me wrong, there are traps in this game which will trigger enemies to spawn, sometimes at a distance, or sometimes right behind you, but these triggers are all fixed, and typically only function once. As such, once you clear a particular area of hostiles, you've generally got an opportunity to set up camp and recover if needed. Though if you didn't do a good enough job securing the area, you will definitely find out the moment you try to rest. Setting up camp is also how you set which spells you want your mages to memorize and which spells you want your clerics and high-level paladins to pray for, as these character classes get various quantities of spell charges per spell level depending on their own experience level. Plus you can find scrolls to scribe to learn new spells. And once you've set which spells to memorize, those party members will always memorize those spells during a round of resting, and you can even have your clerics and paladins speed things along by automatically casting their curative spells every time they get more spell charges prepped. Regardless, once a full resting session is complete, your character should be back to full hit points. Though without curative magic, this can end up taking a while. All the more reason to make sure you've got a cleric in your party. In fact, speaking of your party, you may have noticed that there's kind of a bunch of empty space in the bottom right corner there. This is because even though you can only take 4 party members with you to start, it is possible to get more party members, up to 6 in total, by finding NPCs who are willing to join you, or by resurrecting dead NPCs you happen to come across if you have the means to. And if you already have 6 party members but want to take on another, you have the ability to drop members out of your party, and the game will indeed let you drop party members you initially created for the adventure, just in case one of the NPCs you find happens to be substantially more powerful, Or one of your party members ended up with an untimely fate and you don't think you're going to be able to revive them anytime soon. Yeah, that's something important to keep in mind. This is not a sugar-coated RPG. It may be fair and balanced, but it's also ruthless, as death is permanent without some sort of magical item which can reverse it, or a particular 5th level spell clerics can cast, which doesn't work on elves and permanently reduces constitution by 1 point. So yeah, you kind of want to avoid dying. Worse even than that though is poison. Now, unlike many RPGs where poison is a temporary annoyance, it is extremely dangerous in D&D, as the rules are very simple. Poison is permanent until cured or death. If you rest while poisoned, you die. Well, there's a spell to slow it down and does negate taking poison damage for a while, but if you don't have a means to cure it, it's going to destroy you. And given that the 4th level is chock full of giant spiders with poisonous fangs, yeah, you're going to be getting in a lot of ranged attacks when you reach that leg of your adventure. In terms of actually getting around, that's one aspect of the game I'm not sure if I like or not. Many dungeon floors will have 1 or 2 spots with unusual traps which don't hurt your party, but rather instead change their perspective, either by turning them around, teleporting them, or sometimes both, the results of which are not immediately obvious. I mean, I kind of get what they're going for by having weird traps like this designed to disorient you, but at the same time, I don't feel these kinds of traps really fit the gameplay. Well, not to mention, they get in the way of mapping, which is something you're going to be doing by hand if you don't have that clue book, as the game has no built-in map to access, which can either be a good or a bad thing depending on your own opinion. Though I should point out, even though there's no auto mapping in this game, there are indeed D&D games with auto mapping in them. So I feel having the option would have been better than not having it at all. But then this was still the early days of gaming, so not having a map isn't unexpected. I guess the last thing to mention is that this isn't a very long game. Well, not in terms of actual content. I spent about 8 hours getting about 1/3 through the game, but that only amounted to completing 4 maps, as there's only a total of 12 maps and then you're done. And no, I didn't get to actually fight any beholders. No, I mean, come on, you really think I would have survived that? I can confirm though, they are indeed in the game, as are lots of D&D staples, such as Mind Flayers, Hellhounds, and Zorns, among many others. Though I only know they're there because of the manual. Overall, Eye of the Beholder surprised me in a good way, by being a lot less user-hostile than I was expecting. And it kind of goes to show how just because a game may use this formula, doesn't mean it's doing it as well as this one did, as my entire reason for avoiding this game for as long as I did was because of how hard those other games were. In fact, if you want to play a game like this and don't know which one to start with, well, here you go. Eye of the Beholder is probably the easiest game with this style of 3D dungeon crawling gameplay. Which I want to make absolutely clear, doesn't mean the game is easy, just easier than the other similar titles. Super simple to set this one up in DOSBox this time around, as all you have to do is leave cycle set to auto and it should run perfectly fine. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, a couple Saturdays from now, on August 28th, will be episode 290, closing in on that fabled 300 mark. And as for the game, it's going to be one that's kind of reminiscent of Jill of the Jungle, but otherwise has nothing to do with it. So definitely make sure to stay tuned to see what kind of game this one turns out to be. Thanks for watching everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.